from that was basically the sort of the AV system, where it's still a single member seat. You get a first preference, a second preference, and I think there was a variation within it of, if I remember correctly, others here may also remember, AV Plus, where you could do a multi-member seat of maybe 2-3 people, but you would still work it on first and second preference. Yeah, you know, it was really exciting. And the reason that that came up, that I heard at the time, and that was when I was more engaged in all of this, was that the reason that that was the system that people went for under the Jenkins Commission was the idea that this was likely to be the one which was most likely to get buy-in from Blair and basically a lot of the Labour members and others who were basically sceptical about proportional representation as a whole. So, that Commission report, you know, disappointed virtually. The only good thing you could say about it was it had recognised there was a need for change. Marginal change, but change. That report then sat on a shelf and gathered dust until it came up, you know, as part of the coalition sort of talks 5 years ago, where there was a lot of pressure on Nick Clegg to get a referendum on proportional representation. Unfortunately, the deal that was struck was that the compromise position would be, it would be resurrecting this because this had already gone through a consultation, this was a result of the consultation, blah, 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 and you didn't want to start a consultation all over again, and so that's why it was AV.
Tell them, yeah.
Which really, you know, you're right, was a really sort of dismal proposal that those of us that really wanted to see electoral reform couldn't get excited about. So there were a lot of people in the electoral reform movement that weren't prepared to go out and campaign for alternative vote.
Right.
You know, the campaign itself...
Divide and rule.
Well, I'll say what I thought of it. I thought it was a pretty useless campaign anyway. And that one of the big things that they were saying in it was that basically what they found with focus groups was that what people liked was the idea of politicians working harder. Some of us think we work quite hard. So, a lot of the people who are going to be out there campaigning for this are people who are already elected politicians. And there you are going out there saying to people, I'm an elected politician, make me work harder. So again, you know, a lot of people felt, well, I don't particularly want to go out and do this. You know, it was a campaign not designed to please anybody. It was a campaign almost designed to fail, which it did. And the trouble is that because we've now had that referendum, it makes it much more difficult, I think, to actually make that case again as part of a coalition, if it's another Lib Dem coalition with whoever. Because really you have to take it right back to first base. We've rejected, the public have rejected the outcome of the Jenkins Commission. Right, therefore you need to start again. And it's how you start again without doing an action replay of that, which I think is the question.
There's talk of a constitutional convention needed.
I think it's a constitutional convention plus. And one of the things you need to do with it is to try and make sure that the political parties, I think, are, if you like, okay, part of it, but are not owning this. Because otherwise you will get exactly the same sort of logjams about what system.
I think...
you know, and my God, you've got purists on systems. I remember some others may have been here as well, sort of down the road, just after the last election. So it's a bit long, really. Sort of doing, you know, campaigning for proportional electoral representation out there with our purple ribbons and purple whatever.
Oh yeah, the purple lot.
So associated with a certain political party, and you know, it's still part of the suffragette sort of ensemble, and you know, standing there, and there you were with your chart. What do you want? PR. When do you want it? Now. What system do you want? And everybody laughing because you know, there wasn't an agreement about what it was you actually wanted to push for. And this is another of the problems. This is why you need to take it right back again to first principles. What is it you want your electoral system to do? And then design your electoral system to fit what it is you want it to do. You know, so do you want local representation? You know, what do you want to do with it? And those are the sort of very basic questions, I think, first principles that you need to start from.
Yeah, do you want the...
I don't know.
answering your question, I wanted local and I wanted proportional, and Ireland has both. We have STV has local and proportional. You elect 3 or 4 MPs from your neighbourhood, and you go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just one point that I would say is that there's one that you missed about what happened in the referendum. What happened in the referendum also was it was an unpopular system by everybody. Yeah. Secondly, it wasn't proportional. Yeah. Thirdly, the Tories didn't keep out their promise to support it, and they poured huge amounts of money by millionaires into trashing it. And finally, most importantly, the right-wing press, who actually stand most to lose if we got a proportional system, shafted us. So we went from 30% in favour to 20% against. And that brings me to my point about the fact that we've only got around 60 to 100 constituencies that any vote counts. And so it's around 100,000 people who actually vote counts in this country, 100,000. What that does, it gives huge power to the 5 billionaires. Because that means all of the party leaders can't afford to upset Murdoch and Rothermere and the Barclay brothers, because if they can affect 10,000 of those 100,000 votes, that swings the general election. So it may not swing the country, but that gives them huge power, and that's why they went for it and they trashed it. So that's my interpretation of the history.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, you know.
Yeah.
And the papers.
Media moguls.
It's maybe said already, but I don't know. For me, the whole referendum thing was such a good example of how the wrong kind of political compromise comes back to bite you, because PR was taken off the agenda in the backroom deal, instead of being able to go to the country saying what we want, you know, of course there are complexities, but what we want is a system where the number of seats in Parliament reflects the proportion of votes. You know, it's really...
Say that louder again.
What
we want
is a system where the number of seats in Parliament reflects the number of votes. So if you get 5% of votes, you get 5% of the seats. You know, and like yes, you can talk about the best kind of proportional system. But that allowed for this ridiculous campaign where there was just 2 massive lies. One was vote for AV and it cost the taxpayer 60 million. 60 million was the cost of running the referendum, which was being run anyway, so it's a complete lie. And then the second thing wasn't a lie, but it was highly deceptive. It was like, why would you choose the least popular voting system in the world? Because in any normal situation, when people get to choose the voting system, when they have AV on the one hand and PR, which is kind of like AV but much better, then obviously everyone goes for PR. So I think it's an important lesson to learn in terms of not compromising.
I think, coming back to the original question I posed, but like, how did the Liberal Democrats, who actually have pushed for proportional representation, I believe, for a number of decades or whatever, when they finally get that point where they've got the political horse trading going on down the road, when we were occupying Parliament here in 2010, they had 5 days of no government or whatever it was, where they're discussing, you know, putting the Conservatives back in power. They had the power then. Why did they agree to the crappier system and the crappiest?
Yeah. As a deputy chair previous to that,
Okay.
I wrote about it in my book actually.
Cool.
I remember the Liberal Democrats are committed, and the party's committed, to proportional representation. STV, the Irish system, they're committed to the Irish system of proportional and local, which is STV. It's a brilliant system. Is it working?
Hold it to your mouth.
Is that working? What do I have to press?
Yeah, that's fine.
This one?
Just push it around.
Working? Yeah, they're committed to a proportional system.
No, push it up again, the little side thing, and leave it maybe. I don't know.
1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Can you hear me?
And keep pressing a few
1,
things.
2. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I'll shout.
Yeah.
The Lib Dems are committed, and they're committed to STV, which is the system that you've got local and proportional. I remember being at a federal policy meeting where a senior MP, who shall name nameless, came to the federal policy committee and said we should not go for STV because we would lose seats. And that's when I knew, when push came to shove and they had the power, the establishment inside the Lib Dems would actually shaft us and go for a system that would benefited them and not be proportional. And I believe Clegg and co are part of that betrayal, and that's, to my mind, the real story behind we got a shafted system.
They said we'd lose votes if we went to the Lib Dems would lose votes.
But remember, this applies to all the major parties. The problem you have got with Labour did not support PR because some of their safe seats, like Harry Harman, for example, in Lambeth and Southwark, they would lose seats. So some of the safe Labour seats would be lost under a real proportional system. That's why the Tories hate it, and that's why Labour hate it. Because Labour can get 40 to 50% of the seats on 30 to 32% of the votes. And so can the Tories. So both the Tories and Labour are in hock with each other. They both don't want PR. Now, the majority of the Lib Dems want PR, but the establishment shafted us when they got the... That's my view of what happened.
Yeah.
But I was there, and I heard a senior MP from the south of England go to the follow-up and say, we should not go for this system. And of course, the policy committee said no at the time.
What said that?
They said to the Federal Policy Committee that we should not be in favour of STV because we would lose seats. And that's the problem. Once you win under first past the post, you've got a vested interest in retaining first past the post. Anybody re-elected to that Parliament is elected by first past the post, and that means they've got a vested interest in it, and that's why they didn't campaign for it, and that's why we lost the referendum along with all the other reasons.
Nice one, thank you.
Okay, you have a vested interest in voting against protest rights, by the way. Similar scenario.
I don't know what the solution to that is.
In which Labour and Conservatives combined get less than 50% of the seats, and then you can actually think about changing it.
The Green Party could do something positive after the general election. After the general election, if you get a reasonable number of seats, don't go for proportional representation for Parliament. Go for proportional representation at the local council. Go for STV at council and really hammer that, because then they can't say, oh, we have to have a referendum. We can do it, and if we get that at local government, then the people understand it. And when they get to vote for it, they say, we're not losing this. We like this at local level. We'll grab it at national level. So you could really do something positive by really hammering that after the general election.
Good tactic.
Please push for it at national level as well. I think it's going to be a very different political psychology, essentially, after all these people voting for parties, and it's going to be really obvious how little representation those parties have. I think there's going to be a real hunger for it. So.
I think local government is a winnable one.
I think there's I think there's a real point on that. One of the things that's been happening here, and it's been happening in a number of European countries, is that the two sort of biggest parties are gradually losing vote share.
Yeah.
And this is why you're seeing sort of more grand coalition in Germany, etc., etc. So, and I think this is something that potentially we'll see, at least in terms of votes after this election. And if we get some of the change that's projected to happen in Scotland, that's also going to sort of, I think, will affect Labour. Quite what they then do about it is another thing. But particularly if what happens in Scotland is that Labour loses a lot of seats, but still actually has a very high vote share. And then, given that Scotland has a proportional system for the Scottish Parliament elections, for the local elections as well in Scotland.
STV.
STV for the locals, additional member system, different system for the Parliament. But, people in Scotland are very used now, getting more and more used to seeing their votes reflected in the number of, in the balance of parties returned. So what happens in Scotland is going to be very interesting, very important for Labour. How it plays out is another thing, because of course Labour was promising at least a referendum on PR in '97 while they were out of government. This is it. It becomes a very popular thing with parties out of government, less popular once they won under first past the post. The other factor which will have an impact, I think, with people as opposed to political parties, will be if UKIP get a significant vote and very few seats. Now, very occasionally I begin to think the first past the post maybe has its good points. But this is one of the things that you can see happening, where if you're looking for sort of a grassroots reaction, I think that's one of the places that you get it, which for some of us, it gives us a lot of very difficult questions. But it is this, I think the key part of it is if it's the big parties losing vote share, and therefore Parliament in effect becoming less and less representative, that starts to raise some very, very serious questions about political legitimacy, and just whose hands are on whatever metaphor you care to use, tiller of power or whatever. run out of
Fingers in the till.
Yeah. Well, that one is a different issue, and I've got a lot of sympathy with who actually buys the elections. So then it is this thing about what happens after.